The clay house waited at the far edge of the village, where the road thinned into dust and silence grew louder than voices. Its walls were the color of tired earth, uneven and scarred by years of wind and neglect, as if the house itself had learned to endure without complaint. Amina stood before it with her small bundle in one hand and a folded paper in the other, her fingers stiff not from cold but from disbelief. 12 years of service had been measured, weighed, and concluded in that single sheet of paper. Polite words thanked her for loyalty, praised her patience, and wished her well, then calmly announced that this house, this fragile shell of clay, was all she would receive. No money, no recommendation, no promise of help. Just a key that barely fit the lock and freedom that felt heavier than chains. She pushed the door open, and it answered with a dry groan, as if warning her not to expect comfort. Inside, the space was almost empty, the floor packed dirt, the ceiling low, the walls cracked like parched skin. Thin lines of sunlight slipped through the gaps, drawing fragile patterns that trembled as dust drifted in the air. Amina stepped inside slowly, as though the ground might reject her, then closed the door behind her. The sound echoed briefly and disappeared. For a long moment, she stood still, listening to her own breathing, realizing that no bell would ring, no voice would call her name, no task would be demanded of her. The silence felt wrong. It felt dangerous. Her knees weakened, and she lowered herself to the floor, the letter slipping from her hand. She pressed her palm against her mouth, holding back the sound of grief that had been waiting for years. Tears fell anyway, darkening the dirt beneath her. She had buried her husband with fewer tears than she shed now, because then, at least, people had stood beside her. Now she was alone, and loneliness echoed louder than sorrow. She remembered the mistress's house, solid stone walls, polished floors, rooms filled with objects that existed only to prove wealth. She remembered how she had learned to walk softly so her presence would not disturb the order of things, how she had eaten after everyone else, how she had slept near the kitchen so she could rise before dawn without being called. 12 years replayed themselves in fragments. Winters where her hands burned from icy water. Summers where sweat blurred her vision as she scrubbed floors already clean. Days when guests praised the household's perfection without noticing the woman who maintained it. Nights when she whispered prayers into her shawl, asking only for strength, not reward. She had told herself that loyalty mattered, that patience would one day be seen. Standing now in the clay house, she understood how quietly the world broke such beliefs. When evening crept in, hunger stirred her body from its numbness. Amina rose and stepped outside, the fading light painting the village in muted gold. She walked to the well with practiced steps, her posture straight despite the weight inside her chest. People noticed her, they always did when a story changed. Some watched with sympathy, others with curiosity sharpened by judgment. No one spoke until an old woman beside the well met her eyes and offered a small nod of recognition. "You are starting again," the woman said softly, as if it were both a question and a blessing. Amina drew water and carried it back carefully, refusing help, refusing pity. Inside the clay house, she drank, washed her face, and sat once more on the floor. Darkness fell quickly, filling the cracks with shadow. She lay down with her bundle as a pillow, staring upward, counting breaths instead of hours. Sleep came in broken pieces, carrying dreams of endless corridors and locked doors, of bells ringing without sound. When morning arrived, it did not bring answers, only light. She woke with stiffness in her limbs and resolve slowly forming in her chest. Stepping outside, she studied the house in full daylight. It was worse than she had thought, but it was standing. That would have to be enough. She borrowed mud, water, and tools from a neighbor without explaining, and began to work. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had labored all her life. She pressed clay into cracks, smoothed walls, and whispered encouragement to herself without realizing it. Sweat soaked her clothes, but with each repaired space, something inside her straightened. Near midday, a shadow crossed the doorway. Amina turned to see a stranger standing there, clean shoes, careful eyes, clearly unused to places like this. He asked her name, confirmed her identity, and spoke of records delayed and details forgotten. When he mentioned her late husband and a small inheritance finally released, her breath caught painfully in her chest. It was not much, he said, but it was hers. For a moment, she could not speak. She held the paper he gave her as though it might vanish. After he left, Amina sat on the threshold of her clay house, sunlight warming her face, the earth firm beneath her feet. The house was still small, still fragile, still overlooked. But it was hers. For the first time in 12 years, the future did not belong to someone else. And though she did not yet know how, she felt that this was not the end of her story, but the quiet beginning of something no one had expected. Morning returned to the clay house with a softer light than the day before, slipping through the repaired cracks as if curious about the woman who had claimed the space as her own. Amina rose early, not because anyone demanded it, but because her body still obeyed the habits carved by 12 years of service. For a brief moment she waited for the familiar command, the sharp voice calling her to begin, and when it did not come, she felt both relief and fear. Freedom was still an unfamiliar guest, standing awkwardly at the doorway of her life, unsure where to sit. She prepared a simple meal from what little she had, chewing slowly, counting resources instead of blessings. The document the stranger had given her lay folded beside her, untouched since the night before. Each time she glanced at it, her heart tightened, afraid that hope might dissolve if examined too closely. She had learned to distrust sudden kindness. Still, hunger for certainty pushed her to action. After cleaning her hands and adjusting her shawl, she locked the clay house carefully and set out for the town, the paper pressed safely against her chest. The road was longer than she remembered, or perhaps it only felt that way because she walked it with a different purpose. The town bustled with life that moved too quickly to notice her. Merchants argued over prices, children darted through crowds, carts rattled past without slowing. Amina kept her eyes forward, her steps steady, reminding herself that she belonged here as much as anyone. When she reached the office the stranger had mentioned, her confidence faltered. The building was large, its walls clean and imposing, a place that smelled of ink and authority. Inside, she waited while names were called that were not hers, watching people who looked certain of their place in the world. When her turn finally came, the clerk studied her with mild surprise, then nodded as if recognizing a forgotten detail. Papers were checked, signatures made, and coins counted carefully onto the table. The amount was small, hardly enough to change a life, but when Amina gathered the money into her hands, it felt heavier than gold. It was proof. Proof that something from her past still acknowledged her existence. As she left the office, the sun seemed brighter, the noise less overwhelming. She did not spend the money immediately. Instead, she walked through the market, observing, listening, measuring possibilities. She had no luxury of mistakes. Every choice had to stretch further than its value. By the time she returned to the village, her mind was full of cautious plans. That afternoon, she bought basic tools, stronger than the borrowed ones, and a small sack of grain. Neighbors watched quietly as she passed, curiosity growing. Some offered advice she did not ask for, others warnings disguised as concern. Amina listened politely, but her resolve remained firm. That evening, she worked until her arms ached, reinforcing the walls, shaping the entrance so it no longer leaned like a tired man. Each improvement was modest, but together they began to transform the house from a shelter into a home. As days passed, a rhythm emerged. Amina repaired, cleaned, and planted a small patch of earth beside the house. She learned which neighbors were kind and which were simply bored. Children began to greet her, drawn by the calm certainty in her movements. At night, she lay on a simple mat she had woven herself, staring at the ceiling and imagining possibilities she had once forbidden herself to consider. One evening, as she returned from the well, she noticed a figure standing near her doorway. Her heart leapt with old fear before she recognized the familiar posture of the mistress. The woman looked out of place against the clay walls, her fine clothes dusty, her expression unreadable. Amina stopped a few steps away, water bucket heavy in her hand. "I heard you were living here," the mistress said, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Amina replied calmly. "This is my house." The mistress's gaze moved over the repaired walls, the neat entrance, the small garden beginning to take shape. Something flickered in her eyes, surprise, perhaps annoyance. "You seem to be managing," she said. "I am," Amina answered, meeting her gaze without lowering her eyes for the first time in years. There was an awkward pause. The mistress spoke of circumstances, of how times were changing, of how generosity must be measured. Amina listened without interruption, without anger. When the mistress finally left, offering nothing more than a thin smile, Amina felt a strange peace settle inside her. The encounter had not reopened wounds as she expected. Instead, it closed something old and painful. That night, she sat outside her house under the open sky, stars scattered like promises she had once stopped believing in. She thought of the mistress's surprise, of her own calm, and understood that power did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it grew quietly, in clay houses repaired by steady hands, in lives rebuilt without witnesses. As the village slept, Amina made a silent vow. She would no longer measure her worth by what others chose to give or withhold. She would build slowly, carefully, and on her own terms. The clay house, once a symbol of dismissal, now stood as a quiet challenge to every assumption made about her. And somewhere deep within her, strength long buried was rising, ready to shape a future no one had planned for her.
The silence left behind by the man's departure lingered like a held breath, stretching longer than anyone expected. Plates sat untouched, forks forgotten, as the weight of what had just happened settled into every corner of the restaurant. Alina remained frozen in her chair, her gaze locked on the tablecloth as if the embroidered patterns might offer an escape from the reality pressing in on her. Her friends, who moments ago had laughed and fueled her arrogance, now avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated by their phones or the bottoms of their glasses. The manager cleared his throat and quietly instructed the staff to continue service, but his voice lacked conviction. Nothing could simply go back to normal after a shift like that. Behind the counter, the waitress sat where the man had left her, the envelope resting in her lap like something unreal. Her hands trembled as she opened it, confirming the weight inside, then closed it again quickly, afraid someone might tell her it was a mistake. A fellow server touched her shoulder gently, whispering that she should go home, that everything would be covered. For a moment, she didn't move. She was still trying to understand what it felt like to be defended, to be seen as more than a background figure. When she finally stood, she did so slowly, straightening her back, lifting her chin. As she walked toward the staff door, something subtle changed in her stride. It wasn't confidence exactly, but it was the absence of fear. Near the entrance, Alina suddenly spoke, her voice tight and brittle, calling out to the waitress to wait. Every head turned again. The waitress stopped, but did not turn around right away. Alina stood, smoothing her dress in a nervous gesture that betrayed her unraveling composure. She muttered something that might have been an apology, the words tangled and unclear, more an attempt to save face than to express remorse. The waitress turned then, meeting Alina's eyes for the first time without lowering her gaze. There was no triumph in her expression, no bitterness, only exhaustion and a quiet firmness. She thanked Alina for the apology, whether it was sincere or not, and wished her a good evening. The simplicity of it stung more than any argument could have. Alina opened her mouth to respond, but found nothing to say. The waitress walked out, the door closing softly behind her, sealing the moment. Outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the tension drain from her body. For the first time in a long while, she felt light. Inside the restaurant, the atmosphere remained strained. The manager approached Alina's table, his tone polite but distant, informing her that her reservation had been canceled and that she would not be welcome back. It was said calmly, professionally, but the message was unmistakable. Alina stared at him in disbelief, demanding to know if he understood who her family was. The manager nodded and replied that he did, which was precisely why the decision had been made. Murmurs rippled again as Alina gathered her things in a rush, her hands shaking now, her face flushed with humiliation. As she left, no one watched with sympathy. Across the city, the man who had intervened stepped into his car, the quiet of the interior a stark contrast to the tension he'd left behind. His driver asked if everything was all right. The man nodded, gazing out the window, his expression thoughtful. He knew this small act would ripple outward, that stories like these traveled fast in certain circles. Respect, once withdrawn, was hard to reclaim. Back at her modest apartment, the waitress set the envelope on the table and sat beside it, staring at the wall as the events replayed in her mind. She thought about how easily cruelty had been delivered and how unexpectedly kindness had arrived. She called her mother, her voice shaking as she tried to explain, laughter and tears mixing together. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep slow to come, she realized something fundamental had shifted. She was still the same person with the same struggles, but she was no longer invisible to herself. Somewhere, a powerful man had reminded a room full of people that dignity did not belong to the rich alone. And that truth, once seen, could not be unseen.
The clay house no longer looked like an accident of fate, it looked lived in, defended, and quietly respected. By the time the next season arrived, its walls bore the marks of care rather than neglect, and the small garden beside it offered modest but reliable harvests. Amina moved through her days with a steadiness that surprised even her. She no longer woke with the dull fear of dismissal or the habit of waiting for permission. Instead, she planned. She counted. She imagined. These were small acts of rebellion against the life she had been handed, and they filled her with a cautious confidence. Her work in the village expanded naturally. Women began coming to her not just for help, but for advice. They spoke of unfair wages, of silent endurance, of fears they rarely voiced aloud. Amina listened more than she spoke, recognizing pieces of her former self in their stories. When she did speak, her words were simple and practical, shaped by experience rather than anger. She encouraged them to save quietly, to learn skills beyond what was demanded of them, to understand the value of their labor even when others did not. These conversations happened in hushed tones, over shared meals or during long walks to the well, and they began to weave a subtle network of trust. One afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived from the town council. He came with official papers and polite formality, explaining that the land on which her house stood was being reviewed for potential development. The words were careful, but the meaning was clear: her home was once again at risk. Amina felt the old fear stir, but she did not allow it to take control. She asked questions calmly, requested timelines, and produced the documents she had secured earlier. The official looked at her with mild surprise, clearly not expecting preparedness from a widow in a clay house. After he left, Amina sat alone for a long time. The threat was not immediate, but it was real. She understood now that stability required more than effort, it required foresight. That night, she spoke with Karim and a few trusted neighbors, discussing possibilities she had never considered before. Cooperative work, shared resources, collective defense of their rights. The ideas felt bold, even dangerous, but also necessary. The village had always survived through quiet cooperation, it was time to recognize that strength openly. Resistance did not announce itself loudly. It grew through meetings held under the pretense of shared meals, through careful documentation, through learning who to speak to and when to remain silent. Amina found herself at the center of these efforts not because she sought leadership, but because others trusted her judgment. She accepted the role with humility, aware that visibility brought both influence and risk. As her responsibilities grew, so did the weight on her shoulders. There were nights she lay awake questioning her choices, fearing that one misstep could cost her everything. During those moments, she remembered the day she had first stepped into the clay house, empty-handed and dismissed. That memory anchored her. She had survived worse with far less. One evening, a letter arrived bearing the seal of the mistress's household. Amina's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, old habits surfacing despite herself. The letter spoke of changes, of regrets carefully worded, of an offer to return to service under revised conditions. The mistress acknowledged that perhaps Amina's loyalty had been undervalued. The words were polished, respectful, and hollow. Amina folded the letter slowly and set it aside. The offer tempted her in its familiarity and perceived security. Yet as she looked around her home, the strengthened walls, the shared tools, the quiet evidence of a life rebuilt, she understood what returning would cost her. Not just her labor, but her voice. She replied with gratitude but declined. Her letter was brief and sincere, expressing thanks for the years of work and wishing the household well. When she sealed it, she felt a release deeper than any she had known. The past had reached for her, and she had let it go. The village's dynamics shifted as news of her refusal spread. Some admired her courage, others questioned her judgment. Amina accepted both reactions without defensiveness. She had learned that approval was unreliable currency. Purpose mattered more. As weeks passed, the council's interest in the land cooled, redirected by the collective presence of villagers who now spoke with one voice. The threat did not disappear entirely, but it weakened. Stability returned, tentative but real. One quiet morning, as Amina worked in her garden, she realized she was humming a small, absent-minded sound that startled her. She paused, listening, then smiled faintly. The sound was proof of something she had not noticed growing inside her: peace. The clay house stood unchanged in its simplicity, but everything around it had transformed. It was no longer merely a shelter or a symbol of dismissal. It had become a place where decisions were made, where courage was practiced daily, where dignity had taken root. And as Amina looked toward the horizon, she knew the final test of her journey was approaching, not one of survival, but of legacy.